The US election is just a few short weeks away on the 5th of November. For this update, I sit down with Dr. Scott Osborne, our Chief Investment Officer, to discuss the US election, how it works and what it means for our portfolios. Hello and welcome to this update on the US election. We're going to cover how does it work and what does it mean for us. So Scott, I thought we could do this by starting with a bit of a quick fire to cover some of the basics because there's so much to cover in this before going into some more in-depth questions. First of all, we know it's Trump versus Harris, but what are they actually voting for?
Yeah, it's obviously it's quite a strange system really, but basically this presidential race is a race for the Electoral College, or something called the Electoral College, and every state in the US gets a certain number of Electoral College votes based on how many people are in that state. So for example, California, with lots of people, gets 54 votes, Texas gets 40, and so on and so forth. So what they're actually voting for, and in almost every case, it's a sort of winner takes all of that state. So whoever gets the most votes in California gets all 54 votes, and Harris is going to get all those 54 votes. So basically you have a race for this Electoral College where they're collecting as many votes as they can from every state. It's 538 votes in total. So once you have 270, you have a majority in the Electoral College and your candidate will be the president.
Okay, so not all states are equal then. I've heard about swing states. Some states are swing states. What does this mean? What are they?
Yes, and obviously some states enjoy that sort of profile. So basically California, while is very important because there's lots of votes, as I said, it's staunchly Democrat. So swing states are states where it could, it's very close, that popular vote could swing either to Harris or to Trump, and has swung back and forth in the past. And these are the states really that matter for the election, because if you stack all the states up, we know what most of these ones are going to vote Democrat, we know most of these are going to vote Republican. It's the swing states in the middle that will actually decide the election, because the say 15, 16, 19 Electoral College votes will make the difference in getting one candidate over the line for 270 or not. And just very quickly in terms of what those states are, we have the kind of what we call the Sun Belt states in the south. So Arizona, Nevada, Georgia. I suppose if you're stretching the definition, you could include North Carolina this year. And then we have the kind of Rust Belt / Midwest states in the sort of north, which is Wisconsin, Michigan. Pennsylvania, crucially, is probably a key state. Those are really the states that we're talking about.
Okay, brilliant. You mentioned earlier as well Electoral College, but then we also read and hear about Congress, Senate, House. Where does that come into it?
Yeah, so Congress is obviously the president is the executive. Most of the actual decision and the sort of policy and stuff is decided in Congress. You have the Senate, which is the senior part of Congress, and the House of Representatives is the bottom half. House of Representatives, I think it's 435. They're elected every 2 years, so the whole of the House is up every time there's a presidential election, and that's where spending bills start. So you kind of need to have a majority in the House to get spending plans done. And the Senate sits above that. Senators actually have 6-year terms, so every presidential cycle, so every sort of 2 years, because there's a midterm elections in the presidency, every 2 years a third of the House, the Senate, a third of the Senate is up. So the Senate map changes every election. And it's like, you can have a better or worse situation depending on who happens to be up that year, whereas the House is the same every year, at least everybody's up. And it does matter because obviously those guys will decide spending plans depending on whether Democrats or Republicans can win both the House and the Senate. And that's probably another bit of jargon busting, is when we hear this wave, blue wave or red wave. So when Biden won in 2020, it was a blue wave because the Democrats won the presidency, they won the House, and they won the Senate. And that gave him a bit more freedom in terms of his spending plans.
Brilliant. So thank you for that. Bit of a quick fire covering quite a lot there. Yep. So thank you. One thing I would like to know, and I'm sure our viewers would like to know, does it actually matter who wins?
Yes, I mean, it's a great question really, isn't it? What can they actually do? How much damage can they do? So a few key points on this then. In terms of what they can get done versus what they want to get done, so the promises they make in the election, a lot of that depends on what we said about Congress, so the House. Like domestic spending plans, you have to have the Senate and the House agree them, and so if there's partisan disagreement there, you're not going to get that stuff through. So domestic policy, a lot more difficult. Foreign policy though, they have a freer hand. And we've seen that in the past. Trump particularly lent into the sort of foreign policy side because he could do more there. So things like the Middle East, Ukraine, definitely, there will be changes there depending on the candidate. The other thing to note just on that is that tariffs and trade is a foreign policy technically area, or at least that hasn't been challenged. So some of Trump's key spending, i.e. these proposed tariffs, he could do that without the support of Congress. The other thing to say in terms of what they can get done is neither candidate is particularly bothered about the deficit, which we are. This is the gap between government income and government spending. So under both candidates, the deficit is going to go up probably, and so in a sense, neither of them is really trying to tackle that. So, and that's one of our biggest worries about the US economy generally. So yeah, there is, it kind of does matter, obviously, in certain areas, and it will matter depending on the candidate as well because of the given policies, which we can go into. But that's the kind of key distinction. Domestic stuff and spending, really dependent on Congress. Foreign policy, much freer hand. And this idea that actually neither of them is particularly keen on tackling the deficit anyway. So in that sense, it might not actually, the direction of travel is kind of known anyway.
Okay, so given that a lot of the decisions seem to be based on Congress, is that vote the most important?
Well, I mean, yeah, you could definitely, that's, as I said there, because those domestic spending plans will depend on support from Congress. I think if we look, I mentioned that the map for the Senate this year, you get good and bad maps. It's generally a bad map for the Democrats. So the Republicans probably are going to win the Senate, or at least it's a big ask for the Democrats to hold on because they do currently have a majority in the Senate. So it seems unlikely whether Harris wins the presidency or not that she'll have a blue wave. So in that sense, some of her more ambitious spending plans are not going to happen because the Republicans will likely have the Senate. In the House, that kind of looks like it could go Democrat, although it's much more of a toss-up. So again, on Harris' side, it doesn't really matter because some of her spending will probably be blocked. But on the Trump side, you could potentially have a red wave, i.e. the Senate seems like a reasonable get for them. If Trump wins the presidency, then there's a reasonable case that the Republicans could also be winning the House, and then you're in the red wave scenario. And in that scenario, it definitely is a big factor then because Trump will be able to get some of his domestic policy changes in. So we definitely will be watching the congressional elections just as closely as the presidential election. And probably the best outcome in any given is that there is no wave either way. We don't really want unconstrained Harris, and we don't really want unconstrained Trump. It's nice to have some check or balance from the other party in one side of the House, in one side of the Senate, whether that be Senate or House. So some check on the behaviour is good. So yeah, you're right to point that out, and we definitely will be watching those races just as closely.
Okay, so how does all of this then translate to markets, to our portfolios, and to viewers' pensions or investments?
Yes, I mean that's the key. That's the thing that we actually think about most of the time, and there definitely are big differences depending on some of the policies that could get enacted and all those different scenarios there that we've already said. Because we could have different people in the White House, different mixes of Congress, so Senate and House. Whether there's a blue wave, red wave, etc. There's all these different possibilities, and they're all possible. Some of them are less likely, like the blue wave, but everything else is pretty much still within the realms of possibility. Like this, it's not like anything is completely ruled out. And that's really the challenge, because whilst there are big differences in outcomes, the probabilities of those different outcomes occurring are kind of even. So there's not really much sense in us trying to get ahead of the election with the portfolios. Like we might want to position slightly differently if we knew for sure Trump was going to win the election and the Congress completely, i.e. the red wave scenario. There'll be big tax cuts for companies, so equities would do quite well in that scenario. Obviously, he'll probably withdraw support for Ukraine. That will have sort of macroeconomic knock-on effects. We could potentially plan for that scenario, but that scenario is equally likely as 3 or 4 others, and they're very, very different positioning. So there isn't really much we can do with the portfolios other than just keep a really close watching brief, be prepared to act in certain ways, in certain, with certain outcomes. But it's very much a watching brief. The only one area that we might consider doing something in advance is on US Treasuries, because obviously, as I've said, neither candidate seems to be particularly interested in tackling the deficit, and that's kind of a longer term worry. So we might want to just reduce our Treasury positioning. But again, it's kind of a long term decision anyway, and I'm not sure we'd necessarily be pivoting that just because of the risk around the election. So a wide variety of outcomes with very different results for the markets, definitely. But from the portfolio's perspective, the important thing to know is we're just keeping a close eye on everything, and we do have sort of different scenarios mapped out that we can act on, but only once we know with certainty what is actually going to happen.
Can you touch on some of the key policies for both candidates?
Yeah, okay, so I mean, very broad brush here, but if we take Trump first, and he's more likely probably because of the Congress to get some of this stuff through. On the raising money side, it's basically all tariffs. So 10% blanket tariff on any imports, that's where it doesn't matter, China, Europe, wherever, 10%. And then even bigger tariffs on specific sectors. So he's talked about, depending on what the rally was and sort of how, how excited he was, 60% tariffs, 80% tariffs on China goods. So that's basically the only place he's raising any money. And all of his spending is basically tax cuts. There's not actually very much fiscal stimulus. He's basically just reducing tax cuts, and he's got a huge wish list of these, whether it's tax on overtime, tips, certain contributions, quite a few sort of tax cuts aimed at wealthier individuals. So really for Trump, it's a question of, okay, well, firstly, are the tariffs inflationary, and could they damage growth? And is there enough give back to the economy in terms of these tax cuts to offset any damage to growth? They're really the questions that we'll be tackling, with the portfolio and positioning if he wins. On the Harris side, she's much more about raising taxes. So particularly, she's talked about putting corporation tax back to 28% from currently 21%. Again, I don't necessarily think she'd be able to do that because of the situation in Congress, but that's what she said. And then some other taxes focused on wealthier individuals, increasing basic levies that exist already, but just increasing rates. And then a lot of her spending is more to do on, as you sort of Democrats you would expect, like social care, extended certain parents sort of support, social support, and actually retaining a portion of what's called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was Trump's big tax cutting policy the first time around. Harris has said she will keep some of those tax cuts in place, but only for households with under 400k, which is still pretty, it's kind of middle class. Whereas Trump would just extend them in perpetuity, which costs a lot more money. So Harris is probably less controversial, apart from the pain that might be felt by the equity market because of the corporation tax. We have to weigh that up, but more straightforward and more kind of textbook. Trump is more kind of like would more shake up the boat a little bit, but also might create more opportunities for markets in the short term as well. So again, that's very broad brush, but they're kind of some of the key areas that will move things around both geopolitically and in a sort of market sense.
Brilliant. Okay, so finally, Scott, who's going to win?
Yes, well, I mean, I suppose in a sense that's the $1 trillion question, right? I mean, I've alluded to it there, that just how, the probabilities of all these outcomes is pretty even. It's probably the closest election in modern history. It's a 1-point race, at the top level, Harris is still ahead very slightly currently. Betting markets think Trump will win. And if you consider that the polling error, so how wrong could the polls be, is typically around 4%. Then from where we sit today, it could be very close. It could be a Harris landslide or a Trump landslide, because we are literally right down the line. I think the things to watch out for in terms of, if Trump wins with a landslide, what we'll be talking about is the fact that his line on immigration really cut through. He's probably flipped some of those Rust Belt Midwest states that we talked about back to Republican, and the Democrats didn't get their vote out. That's probably the scenario that Trump does well. If the Democrats win, and in a big way, then we've probably got, the Roe versus Wade, abortion, IVF stuff is probably a bigger issue than the polls appreciate. Maybe younger voters got out more. Maybe they were underestimating how much of the Latino and Black vote has moved to Trump because he's made inroads there. Those are the kind of ways, the paths to bigger outcomes. But generally, I think it will be very, very close. And I would, probably whoever wins Pennsylvania will win the election. That's kind of the tipping point state, as it were, where if you win Pennsylvania, you probably win in Michigan and Wisconsin anyway, and then you don't really need any of the other swing states. That's enough for the Democrats, and it's certainly enough for the Republicans. There are some niche scenarios where there could even be a draw this year. It's probably one of the maps where it's still a very unlikely outcome, but it's probably more possible than it has been in history. But for me, I'd watch Pennsylvania. I think whoever wins Pennsylvania will win the White House. That's been the case since 1968. And I think only twice before that in the last 100 years. And even in 68, this was when Nixon when Nixon won the White House, and it was a very strange year because obviously Johnson had already withdrawn, much like Biden did, who was the incumbent. The Democratic frontrunner for the nomination was a young guy called John F. Kennedy, and I think we know what happened there. So even that isn't really a good example. So if you can win that keystone state in Pennsylvania, you probably win the election. At the moment, it's a complete coin toss as to who is going to win that state, which is why we're not actually doing anything in advance. We'll just keep a real close watching brief and respond to things as and when they come in. It will definitely be a long night, and if the vote is really close, we might not even know who the winner is for a day or two. And even then, if the House and Senate races are really tight, we might not even know if they've got total control of Congress for like a week or two even. So there will definitely be this period of uncertainty afterwards, but we are very prepared and ready to move things around if we feel like we need to in the immediate aftermath.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Scott. And thank you for watching. Our next investment update we will bring to you after the budget, which is at the 30th of this month, and after the US election, which is on the 5th of November. So we'll have plenty to update you with then. See you next time.